Dr. O. It's always great to be with you. Headlines from this past week. Washington State Governor Bob Ferguson signed into legislation a bill that would put rent control measures in place for the state of Washington. It's joining a relatively small number of states around the country. I believe it's 3 that have like very specific rent control laws. But this is a subject that seems to polarize. The idea of rent control overall, is it a good one? Is it a bad one? And then we'll talk about this particular policy.
Look, it's definitely a terrible policy. Okay. It's just a bad one. All right. That's it. And it's not coming from me. So don't accuse me of anything. Don't blame me. Don't point fingers at me. It's just overwhelming evidence, coming from the, academic literature on this topic. I have absolutely nothing to do with it. So don't point your finger at me. In fact, I have never actually, done a rent control study myself. I'm only pointing to the scientific literature on the topic. And I understand why it is so popular. Of course, there are short-term benefits, right? And the short-term benefits is, of course, it's going to protect the, existing tenants by limiting their rent increases, right? Yeah. So like if you already live in the house, it's keeping your rent artificially low, when compared to market rents. And so you're like, well, I'm okay. There's a downside to that though, is that you stay in the unit so much longer than you normally would. The house is likely no longer the right house for you. If a job comes up somewhere else, guess what? You're not moving to go to that job. So it has broad economic implications. If young, healthy, able workers with skills are no longer moving to where the best jobs are for them, right? Then you get a dip in productivity, in economic productivity and economic growth.
Yeah.
That's one of the unintended consequences, but there are many unintended consequences, and I could go down the list.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. So, I mean, when you look at rent control in Washington State, what you're really looking at would be rent control primarily in the greater Seattle area, King County, Snohomish County. I mean, that's, where I think that there is a, perceived housing shortage, or where
there is a very real housing deficit.
I was being deferential. I apologize. I'll never do that again. Inside of this bill that was passed, just to be clear, I'm taking this directly from Carlene Johnson's story from the Center Square. After some back and forth between the two chambers, and this is discussion in the Washington State Legislature. After some back and forth between the two chambers, lawmakers passed engrossed House Bill 1217, which limits rent increases to 7% plus inflation or 10%, whichever is lower. The rent cap for manufactured and mobile homes is 5%. I'm not sure that there's a tremendous number of mobile homes, in Seattle proper. Landlords could still set rent at whatever they please when a tenancy begins. So, with rent control coming on and this bill going into effect, I'm not sure what the start date for this would be. Typically, a piece of legislation is decided, of course, during the legislative session, and then it would go into effect. I'd have to see when this goes into law. But can we expect in this moment, rents in Washington State, specifically in the Seattle King County area, to increase immediately to account for what would be coming in terms of rent control?
I mean, I guess the first thing would be, you'd have to have, unfortunately, the landlords would have to, basically push out tenants that are there, right? So there's a lot of nuances to this policy. And I'd have to really take the time to analyze all of the levers, because I think they're very familiar with the literature. And so they try to put in a bunch of levers to minimize the impact. So I can't speak specifically to this one policy, because I would have to take a little bit of time to analyze all of the little levers that they put in there. But I can tell you just in general that, very often when you limit rent increases, what tends to happen is you get less investment in rent controlled areas, not only in the number of units that are built or that become rental units, but also in the quality of those units. We've seen that throughout everywhere that's been tried. The second thing is, because the quality of the units decreases, due to, less investment, private investments flowing to those rent controlled areas, property tax revenues, the value of those units also is much lower, and property tax revenues also dip because those units are not as valuable to the marketplace as other similar units that are not in a rent controlled area. So it also hurts local governments trying to raise enough property tax revenues to go ahead and invest in the community. I also mentioned reduced mobility, right? Worker mobility. And so in the long run, what you end up with is a local economy that is worse off, for all the reasons I highlighted. And so that is the cost. And ultimately, who bears the cost?
Let's talk about that. Yeah. Where does the cost ultimately fall?
It's ultimately lower income families. It's lower income families, that basically will have fewer available units in worse conditions, and that will face higher rent increases over the long run, because, right, that are no longer moving in search of opportunity, because they're stuck in a unit, because they won't be able to afford anything else. And they're right. And so that's the problem with this idea in general. Right. And again, I'm not speaking about this particular policy because I haven't analyzed it, but I'm telling you that just in general, rent control has been tried and it has failed every single time. It is a popular thing, but it's not necessarily good policy.
Yeah, and to clean up my data, so with Washington coming aboard, and I'm not certain when this takes effect, whether it's January 1st, 2026 or sometime later this year, the only two states that have a statewide rent control legislation on the books would be California and Oregon. So now the entire West Coast of the United States would have statewide rent control. And of course, we talk about rent control. I mean, typically you think about, metropolitan markets. There are some cities that have, municipal rent control, New York City being one of them, Washington, D.C. being another one. There's some larger cities in New Jersey, and Maryland also. But, yeah, I appreciate your thoughts on this. This is an evolving story, something, that we want to keep an eye on. We'll certainly come back to, something that we'll have to take a look at in the long view.